We are so back. So, long words on song words, what can I say? It's been a while since I've done any videos for this channel. I mean, there's been some reasons for that, of course. Life things have happened. I am, as you can see, in a new place, new life circumstances, and I thought, this would be a good time to just restart the channel, start it over, see where I can take it. I don't have any plans for regular content or anything just yet. We'll see how this goes in the not-too-distant future. But I figured I'd start us off with a pretty simple, pretty easy, pretty, you could almost say clickbaity topic, and something to copy some of my friends who you've seen on other channels like Notes Review, Similitude of Prague, Nathan on Shovel, Rhyme Signatures, and so on. And that's to cover sort of opposites. We're talking about things like, bands, songs, albums that we should love but don't, or shouldn't love but do. And I thought I would tackle 3 albums from each category. So, I'm always told to start with the bad news first, and I figure we should start with the negativity. Get the albums that I should love but don't out of the way. Now, these are albums that I should love based on my taste in music, my love of these particular artists, but for whatever reason, I just never could get into them. So we're going to start with an album that's kind of considered a masterpiece by a good number of fans of this artist, an album that I just could never get into. Now, I've never been a super fan of this artist in the past, but I've generally liked everything I've heard that he's put out. I've reviewed a couple of his works on this channel in the past. I am talking about Neil Morse. And specifically, I'm talking about the final album that he released with his former band, Spock's Beard, Snow. This is a sprawling double concept album, kind of in the vein of something like The Who's Tommy, and it's definitely Spock's Beard's version of that. And this is one of those albums where, if I ever listen to any song from it individually, I think it's great. But I could never get into listening to this album as a whole work. So many albums that Neil Morse has worked on in the past, whether it be with Spock's Beard, like The Kindness of Strangers, V, or as a solo artist like Sola Gratia, Sola Scriptura, or with the Neil Morse Band like The Great Adventure, Similitude of a Dream. Those are all fantastic records front to back, and I can often get through those albums in one sitting without much issue. But Snow just never... I could never listen to this album in one sitting and really feel like I connected with it. I'd always just get bored and reach for the stop button and just, I want off this ride. Which is a shame, because there's a lot of really good material on Snow, but I just could never get into listening to this album as a complete work. For the second album on this list, you could pretty much copy and paste everything I said about the first album into this one as well, and it's an album that's also, likewise, considered an absolute masterpiece in the prog rock genre. I am talking about Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I do love Genesis a lot, and I mean a lot, especially the Peter Gabriel era, and I'm not gonna lie, the albums that they released between Gabriel's departure and Duke are all fantastic records. I even have a soft spot for some of their pop era stuff. I even don't hate Calling All Stations. And I don't hate The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I think there's some really fantastic material from this album. One of their most poignant efforts with The Carpet Crawlers, and I really love The Cage. I think it's a great song. But again, it's just one of those albums that just feels like such a slog to sit through, and I have such a difficult time getting through this album, its concept is a little nebulous to me. It just doesn't feel like a very well-formed idea of an album to me. And I know a lot of prog fans who would thoroughly disagree with me on that fact, but I just never could stomach The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway the same way that I could with Selling England or Nursery Crime or Foxtrot or even Wind and Wuthering, A Trick of the Tail. All of those albums I much prefer listening to front to back over and over again than The Lamb. And then for the last album on this part of the list, this is going to surprise a lot of people, especially considering that it contains one of my favorite songs of all time, and that is Dream Theater's Octavarium. Now, Dream Theater, I mean, if you're a fan of me and this channel and have watched videos in the past, or have watched videos with those other content creators I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you know Dream Theater is one of my favorite bands of all time, and that I pretty much cherish everything they've ever released. However, Octavarium, and I went over this in the Similitude of Prog's video where we all did rankings of Dream Theater albums, but Octavarium ranks fairly lowly for me on their overall album ranking because this album to me feels like Dream Theater with an identity crisis. On the one hand, you have some really incredible tunes, like, of course, the title track, one of my favorite pieces of music ever constructed by human beings. And I think Panic Attack is also a really good statement from the band, or just a really good solid prog metal tune. But then you have tunes like I Walk Beside You and Never Enough, where it feels like they aren't even really trying to hide their influence. In fact, they're even going so far as just blatantly writing a Coldplay song, a Muse song. You know, These Walls feels like any generic nu metal piece from that era. You would have a hard time convincing me that they were really firing on all cylinders with that record. They took all of the energy that they had saved for this record and put all of it into the 24-minute epic title track. I mean, even Sacrifice Sons, well, it's fun and it's cheesy, but I don't think it's really anybody's favorite Dream Theater song. I mean, really, the only other sort of upside to this album is The Root of All Evil, and I still think it's probably my least favorite part of the 12-step suite. So, Octavarium, despite being a very personally important album for me in that it came about during a rough time in my life, and you know, you don't say this about a lot of albums as seriously as I do with this, but it saved my life. And having just one of the greatest title tracks of any Dream Theater record in the past, present, probably for the future, I just don't like the album as a whole as much as many of their other albums. I think it's a pretty weak album overall, despite having their best song on it. So now we get to albums that I shouldn't love, but for whatever reason, I do. And unlike with the first list, you know, some of these artists aren't really artists one would associate with me. Maybe that's the reason why I love the album, but probably shouldn't. So I'm going to get started with an album that came out in 2003 and is from a band that I generally have a lot of love and respect for and have generally enjoyed most of their releases. And this is an album that was very critically panned on its release, but I kind of got it right away, and I always loved this album, even from the first time I heard it, and that is Saint Anger by Metallica. I know a lot of people are going to come in and jump in and talk about the trash can snare, the lack of guitar solos, the repetitive and long song structures, the trashy vocals, and all of those points are absolutely valid and objectively correct. But there was something about this album that I think stood out to me even in 2003 when I was at the age of, 17 years old, and just being an angry young man myself at that point, And having had a few Metallica albums under my belt by then, Metallica were one of the first bands I really got into as a kid. And of course, I didn't really get into them invested in the whole their first four albums are the best deal and everything after sucked. But I knew that albums like Load and Reload were not anything like And Justice for All and Master of Puppets. That was just not a thing. And I knew that there was kind of something happening during this time where metal bands were starting to become more metallic again. You started to have heavier riffs. You started to have more double kick drum. Metal was starting to become a more popular thing again. And I think Metallica really saw what was going on in the music scene and said, well, we'll have some of that again. It's been a while since Lars busted out his double kick drums. It's been a long time since I've sang in that growly rasp. It's been a long time since we've tuned our guitars that low. And I think with Metallica, their personal struggles during the time also came through on that album. This was the album they needed to make to go on to make the obviously much more critically impressive albums of Death Magnetic, Hardwired to Self-Destruct, and most recently 72 Seasons. All also good records in their own right. But Saint Anger was the album that, if they hadn't made this, those albums wouldn't have been possible. And I think I got it at the time. I got that this was the album that spiritually and musically they needed to make. They needed to come out with something that was just raw, heavy, devoid of any ego, devoid of any quality, to put it lightly. So, yeah, this is an album that I absolutely adore it. I still put it on every now and then. I still think it's a great record. I think it's a very important album in Metallica's discography. And maybe I shouldn't love it. Maybe I should hate this album the way so many other Metallica fans do, but I think it's a great record. Now, getting into more bands that maybe you wouldn't normally associate with me, Linkin Park is a band that comes up a lot in that, where you wouldn't really think I was a rap rock guy, but you have to remember that I grew up in the era of, nu metal being on TV all the time. Korn and Limp Bizkit were a big part of my youth experience. And going into high school, bullying was a big issue in our school. I suffered a lot of it. And like a lot of kids my age during that time, bands like Linkin Park were a real godsend to us. They made us feel like we were listened to. However, the album that I shouldn't love but do isn't one of their more popular records, like Meteora or Hybrid Theory. It's 1,000 Suns. This is an album that really divides Linkin Park fan opinion even to this day, where it takes on a very different sound and very different stylistic theme than we're used to from Linkin Park. Whereas other Linkin Park albums are about personal matters, things that matter to us as individuals. 1,000 Suns is more of a concept album about societal collapse, existential crises that all of us have. I think that makes this a very interesting record from the band because on so many levels, lyrically, it's much more mature than something like, One Step Closer or In the End or Numb or Crawling. Those songs definitely feed more into that, bullied teenager kind of vibe, whereas 1,000 Suns is more about the kind of fears that we all have as adults. Maybe as parents, maybe as teachers, maybe just as a society in total. And I think that's a really compelling concept. Something that, prog rock fans should really look at and go, maybe they have something here as a concept record. But also musically, Linkin Park was going in a very interesting direction in this time, whereas on the first two records, they had the rap rock deal with a very strong electronic bent to it, but still strong guitar work, strong acoustic drums. And then with their third album, Minutes to Midnight, They mostly stripped a lot of the electronic elements back, brought the guitars more front and center, released more of a rock album than a rap rock record. But with A Thousand Suns, it's almost kind of hard to pin down what kind of genre they were going for. Something with a very electronic kick to it, but also still very progressive. Lots of little short musical interludes, toying around with things like synth solos, weird time signatures, extended song structures. This was an album that really felt like a cohesive work of art, as opposed to just a collection of songs. And I think looking at it from a progressive rock perspective, I can see why a lot of Linkin Park fans really didn't get this album at first. But I could see how I might find it really compelling. It's a concept album. The musicianship is of a higher caliber than I'm used to for Linkin Park, and it feels like a complete work. So for me, that really made A Thousand Suns a compelling deal to listen to. So lastly, we have The Second Law by Muse. And this is an album that really also divides fan opinion a lot in Muse's fandom. You know, there's usually the idea of like Muse before The Second Law and Muse since The Second Law. But for me, I love The Second Law. It's one of my favorite records of theirs. My favorite is even an album that people probably think I shouldn't love, which is The Resistance, but I think that The Second Law has some absolutely wonderful songs on it. You've got Supremacy with that 7-string James Bond drop A riff. It's so cool. Panic Station has some of the funkiest bass I've ever heard in a Muse song. And I mean, this is for a band that has really strong bass work. And then you've got the Prelude and Survival, which is just the biggest Queen-like cheese fest I can think of. And yet, as cheesy and terrible as it is, it's also just so good. And then you have some interesting stuff later on in the record where you have songs sung by the other members of the band, which is something they'd never really done before and haven't done since, including some songs that have some more progressive elements than we've been used to. I mean, really, the only kind of dip in quality on this record is the song Madness, which I think is a perfectly serviceable pop single on an otherwise really good album. I'm even not a big hater of the dubstep moment. I think it's kind of cool. I think they definitely took a direction with this that's a little different, a little nutty. But this is one of Muse's nuttiest moments, and I really gotta hand it to them. They did a wonderful job on that. So there you have it. That's 3 albums that I should love but don't, and 3 albums that I shouldn't love but do. Anyway, it's been fun to record this video again. I hope to come out with more content like this in the future. Maybe some more album reviews. That would be wonderful. I've got a couple albums. Maybe I might think of doing some reviews. Once again, don't expect any regular content from me right now. I'm still just getting used to being set up in this new apartment, getting my recording set up back to what it used to be, and just finding the time and motivation to do this. You know, that's a big factor in all of this, but living on my own, I think I'm going to have a lot more time to do stuff like this on a regular basis. So it's been great seeing you all again on this channel, and I hope to do more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching. Take care, everyone.